and welcome to Watershed Moments. I'm Rhonda Pendell Charles, City Councilwoman for the City of Annapolis, Ward 3. We have a very special guest with us here today, Mr. Jeff Huntington, who's an artiste, or whatever you want to say, but we're so thrilled to have Jeff here with us today, and I know he's going to have some interesting information to give to us, and we're so thrilled to have you, Jeff, today. Thank you so much for being on Watershed Moments.
And I'm so thrilled to be here. Thank you for having me.
Oh, absolutely. Now, we're going to start at the beginning with the Jeff story. Okay. Tell us a little bit about your early years, Jeff.
All right. Well, as far back as I can remember when I came into the world, I was the youngest of 4 kids. I had 2 older brothers and a sister. All were artists. My dad was an artist. My grandma and grandpa on my dad's side were artists. And when my earliest memory was of making things and drawing and using color and building sculptures with crayons and seeing what my brothers and my father and grandparents were doing. And so I wanted to emulate them. So as far back as I can remember, that's pretty much what I thought I was supposed to do, was be an artist. I never had a question or a desire to be a fireman or a policeman or a doctor or a lawyer. I just always thought I was supposed to follow in their footsteps.
Now, where did all this occur?
For me, this started, my lights turned on in California. My dad was in the military, so we moved around a lot. My brothers were born in Japan. My sister and I were born in Texas. Then they got stationed in California. And until the first Star Wars came out, we lived in California. And Star Wars is relevant here because they put Star Wars cards in the bottom of Wonder Bread loaves in the 70s. And I collect those Star Wars cards. And when my dad was stationed here in Maryland in 78 or 79, he then began working night shifts at a private insane asylum. And during the day, he would go to art classes. And he was also the custodian of this small art school in Silver Spring to help offset his tuition. And he brought me with him so my mom could go work during the day. They didn't make a whole lot of money. So we they did a lot, everything they could for the 4 of us. But I grew up in this art school called Maryland College of Art and Design in Silver Spring.
Now tell us a little bit about elementary school.
Elementary school, well, I started in California, moved around. Our family moved around about 11 times.
Wow.
But I was still pretty young when we stopped moving and landed here in Maryland. But about 3rd grade on was spent here in Maryland, and I can remember being a comedian in the during recess during playground as a survival technique.
Okay, all right. So 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade.
3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th. Yep. I grew up in Prince George's County, in Largo, Maryland. All right. And
moved on to junior high, middle school?
Moved on to middle school there, and
still interested in art?
Still always doing art, but at that time I became a juvenile delinquent and ran with kind of a delinquent crowd and learned how to steal cars. By the time I was 13, so I was a pretty good driver and had a fake ID business. Started to learn how to hustle. And by the time I was 15, it was time to go to high school, and I did not. That did not compute with me. And I tried it for a couple weeks, but I couldn't focus. I couldn't. I had so much anxiety, and I just didn't want to be there. So, me and my best friend, we stole his father's car, a Ford LTD, and we drove to Cocoa Beach, Florida. Wow. And so that began my journey, and probably one of my first watershed moments at that time. That didn't last very long, but I did manage to get a job, lie about my age.
In Florida?
In Florida, so I can get a job washing dishes. And eventually I began following the Grateful Dead around the country. This was in the mid-'80s, and I spent 3 years following the Dead around the country, peddling weed and learning how to make tie-dye t-shirts, and I started a business there, and went to state, parking lot to parking lot, going to these shows, hustling these wares and goods.
How old were you during that time?
I was 14, 15, 16, and I was sending money home to my folks, so that was just something I thought would always buy me more time. And met some young kids who just graduated high school from Cherry Hill, New Jersey. And we traveled around together for about a year, and when they found out how young I was, we were always experimenting with drugs and drinking and partying. They were on their first summer of freedom after high school and before going to college. They were going off to McGill University in Canada and Rutgers University. And when they found out I was only 16 and I wasn't getting an education, they grew concerned and really started to mentor me.
Wow.
And we continued to party, but they cut me off. One day a week, they bought me a small GED book, and they forced me to read this book and apply for the GED test. So I did.
So you just happened upon these people?
I happened upon these people. We traveled together. We lived one summer in Ocean City, Maryland together. And so we bonded. And so they kind of began to look out for me like big brothers when they found out that I was so young and not in school. So I eventually took the test and barely passed, and I was mailed a Maryland high school diploma. So another watershed moment. At this time, I was hustling, doing illegal activities, and I got so excited about the Maryland high school diploma. For the first time, I thought about college because I could now attend a college. So my parents were very concerned.
Of course.
But this was a quick turnaround, and I was so motivated to make paintings. So I prepared myself to go to art school, and I had this weird idea that already everyone in art school were masters. I just didn't have a real grip on reality, and I learned how to paint from my dad's art books when I was a teenager. So before applying to the art school, after I got my high school diploma in the mail, I spent a year painting, and I set out to make a painting a day for the next year.
Now, what year was this, approximately?
This was, at this time, was about 1989, 1990 to 1990. And I managed to make about 300 paintings.
Wow.
And at this time I was trying to emulate Claude Monet and the French Impressionists. So I found myself in California, rented a box truck, and drove across the country. And I had an uncle in California who built racks, angled racks to hold wet oil paintings in the back of this box truck, so I could travel the country, paint landscape paintings, and fill up the truck with what I was doing.
So you were painting one a day.
I was painting.
So were you selling them, or how did that all?
Eventually, I got to selling them to friends and family, and just kind of networking like that. I didn't really have art shows yet until I got to art school. I eventually went to the Corcoran College of Art and Design, where I am I'm currently an adjunct professor there now.
Now, where's Corcoran?
The Corcoran is in D.C. It's
I've heard of it.
The Corcoran was established in 1890. The museum was established in 1850s, so it's a pretty old place. And I met my wife there 25 years ago. Later, we didn't get married until 10 years after that. But
so you went from California to Maryland, selling artwork along the way and painting along the way?
well, I wasn't selling the artwork along the way. I was just painting
Okay.
along the way at that time, and kind of transitioning my life from this sort of hippie, neo-hippie delinquent to a serious artist, and trying to figure out how to make a living.
So how were you making a living at that time?
Well, so briefly I went back to Maryland and got a job working at Heckinger's
Oh,
hardware
yes.
store,
Oh, yes.
making like $3.50 an hour. So I wasn't really making money compared to what I was making, but I was transitioning and I had to figure things out. But I began getting commissions through my sister worked for the courthouse, friends and family from New York to Maryland were always impressed with what I was doing and were very supportive and encouraging. And through family and friends, I just managed to sell almost everything that I did.
I guess at this point your parents were relieved?
Oh, they were over the moon when they saw that I was applying seriously for art school and then was able to get scholarships. And so you had to supply 20 slides for them to look at your portfolio to be accepted into the school, and I brought them like 60 slides because I just had so much work because I was dead serious and I was just painting every day. And you know, when I got to art school, I learned that it wasn't what I thought it wasn't. People weren't masters, you know, already, and that's more what graduate school was like.
Oh, okay.
So eventually, I got a bachelor's in fine arts from the Corcoran. It was a 4-year degree. And then I applied for graduate schools and ended up going to the Art Institute of Chicago to get a master's degree, and I got a full scholarship there. And so I moved to Chicago and continued having shows at that time and selling paintings. And then eventually I moved to New York City from there.
Wow. Now, what year did you move to New York?
I moved to New York City in 1997 after graduate school. So that was all, for a long time, that was my destination, where I always wanted to be, was New York City, because that's where, in my mind, the art world was. And that's, if you were a serious artist, that's where you went.
And
so that's where I ended up.
And art isn't my forte, but how do artists make their money? I mean, you went from Chicago to New York.
I learned then to be an artist in a cutthroat big pond like New York City, you have to hustle and you got to work full time on the side to make your art if you're not already an established artist. So I got a job working for an art handling company. And an art handling company are moving companies of art, of high-end art. So they're specialized movers who handle only art, and they handle the Picassos, they handle the mid-career artists, established artists, and the most famous artists in the world. So in doing so, there's I always imagine this art world pyramid, and at the top of the pyramid are blue chip art collectors. These are the millionaires and billionaires who have so many buckets of money, they're running out of buckets, so they took all the overflow money and created the art world, the art market. So below them you have art critics and art dealers, and there's about one dealer to every million artists out there. So it's with the artists, so dealers and critics have a lot of power. And so below that you have the bottom of the tier, you have the artists. Now below the pyramid there's a layer of scum. Those are art handlers, the people who work for the art handling companies and move the art for all the artists and celebrity art collectors, dealers. However, I learned that being this scum at below the pyramid, those people had access to every tier on the pyramid on a daily basis. So I kept slides of my artwork in my pocket every day when I went to work, never knowing who I would meet. And every day I met art collectors and artists, my art heroes, celebrities.
Name a few.
Leonard Nimoy. I've spent several afternoons hanging out with Leonard Nimoy in his Upper West Side apartment. Because he's a photographer and artist himself, or was. His wife was on the board of the LA County Museum, so she was very involved in the art world, and the two of them were big art collectors. So they would, you know, when they bought a new Liza Lu sculpture, we would bring it to them, install it in their home. Leonard Nimoy was just the friendliest person in the world. They would wear matching sweatsuits and matching moccasins, and she wore the pants in the house, strangely. And she would, you know, tell us where to move things. He would chime in, and she would put him in his place. Say, Leonard, you just stay out of it, you know. But I've met Blondie,
Oh, wow.
David Byrne, Isabella Rossellini, my heroes in the art world, Jasper Johns, Chuck Close. We've helped people move like, I can't, well, I don't know, the list goes on. Just a lot
So
of people.
being an art handler was in essence a watershed moment as well, getting that position at job.
Absolutely, and I did so much. So art handling companies, today there are probably hundreds of them in New York City. There's about one in Maryland, and they have offices in the Bronx. That's because there's not a big art culture in Maryland, contemporary art culture. In New York City, there's probably hundreds of these companies now. In the 90s, when I moved there was only a small handful, and I worked for one of the first ones, Atelier 4, who started in 1989 in a bread truck and just kind of going around and hustling and saying, yeah, we'll move your art. We move specifically art. People are paying tens of thousands of dollars for art. They don't want FedEx or UPS or furniture movers to come handle it. I mean, eventually we were moving Picassos. We would have armed guards with us in some cases.
Wow.
We would move paintings from an art collector's home, a collector who had maybe a $300 million art collection, to Christie's or Sotheby's auction house where they would fetch $10 to $20 million. And these kinds of arts required oftentimes an armed escort.
Oh, wow.
And the white gloves, of course, and we would build the crates, and we've built $10,000 crates for one painting before. And we're talking climate-controlled crates with tip and tells on them. So it's a real specialized world for very wealthy people. So,
So 1997, and between 97 and now, give us a flavor of what you've been working on.
So I reconnected with my wife now, who I met in art school 25 years ago, and we decided to get married, and she moved back to Annapolis, where she was born and raised. She's a sailor. She grew up sailing, and she ended up inheriting her childhood home here in Annapolis, and we commuted back and forth between Annapolis and Brooklyn, New York for a while, and eventually decided that I would move here and set up a studio, and that gave me the opportunity, not having to work full-time and then make art, gave me the opportunity to feel things out in a different world. I was able to get a big studio for a lot less than I was paying in New York. However, it was a real culture shock, and nobody in Annapolis wanted anything to do with my contemporary artwork. Although I was represented by galleries in other cities, and I was showing internationally by this time, I could not get an art show in Annapolis with my work, because it's more of a maritime town, and they're used to more conservative, sort of maritime themed work. So I began painting birds and flowers and to deal with my depression and sort of try and integrate, but it took me about 6 years of being here, of sort of fighting through this depression and showing people my work. And I didn't want to paint birds and flowers anymore, although I sold them all. Every one of them sold, people loved them, but it left me empty inside. So my wife and I invested what little money we had in screen printing equipment, and I opened a screen printing shop, custom screen printing t-shirt shop in the studio on Hudson Street.
Right in Ward 3.
In Ward 3. Yes. And that allowed me to take on that as a job, and then I could paint whatever I wanted to paint again. And what I had always been painting since those Star Wars cards in 1977, 78 were portraits. So I wanted to go back to portraits to address other issues, cultural issues, historical, psychological, social issues, health issues. I've spent years working on a series called Plaques and Tangles, which focused on Alzheimer's disease, which my father lived with for 14 years. And I have 14 or 15 nieces and nephews, and they became the subjects for me, my models.
Oh.
But the paintings weren't about them, they were always about these conditions. For a couple years, I did a series called Bliss Point, which was about the highs and crashes of sugar addiction in young children. Again, I used my nieces and nephews for models and addressed these issues and made collages out of images of sugar-based products and made portraits of them in various states of euphoria or depression, things affected by the way our sort of relationship with food in our culture. So if you see the front of Metropolitan Kitchen and Lounge, there's a two-story portrait of a screaming boy. That's one of my nephews after he drank a 20-ounce Mountain Dew. And Gavin Buckley let us do a portrait of, that was from the Bliss Point series. And I've shown this work in Milan, Italy, in a show called Are We What We Eat? Sustenance and Art. And and then I created a show based on that called Bliss Point, which I showed it in Porter Contemporary in New York City and Reyes and Davis in Washington, D.C., and those are galleries that represent my studio work.
Now tell us a little bit about your traveling with your artwork and the places you've been and what's upcoming.
Well, in the past couple of years, I have a new love affair with murals, and I've met some street artists a couple of years ago, and they encouraged me to try working on a large scale with what I was doing in the studio. And at first I didn't see how that could be possible, but then I just fell in love with the idea of always recreating myself as an artist. So this gave me a real opportunity to just run a whole new direction. So starting with support in this town, like Gavin Buckley, who owns businesses here, and Dry 85, Brian Bolter commissioned us to do a mural. I met Jimmy Davies, who's a local musician, and we collaborated on hundreds of artworks between 2011 and 2013, and we did some murals together. Eventually, I hooked up with these Brazilian street artists.
Well, in the Annapolis Design District in Ward 3.
Yes, and we've worked together in Annapolis 2 years in a row, and in between, I was able to, through Urban Walls Brazil, to travel to Sao Paulo last summer and paint with them down there. So that was my first long distance travel to make artwork on a large scale. And in one case we worked in a favela in a very poor area. In another case we worked in the arts district in a part of downtown Sao Paulo. And since then, or just before then, I was invited to paint in at Art Basel in Miami, which is the largest art fair in the world. And muralists come from every continent, all over. And so that was a real great opportunity to meet more experienced street artists and do some more traveling. So I was able to paint in Miami, and then I did some more work here with the Tsunami mural and the Edgar Allan Poe mural at Spa Circle. And then in October of last year, I went to Brooklyn, New York, and painted a two-story Nelson Mandela in another poor section of Brooklyn in Brownsville, the neighborhood Mike Tyson grew up in. And from there, I have gone to DC, and I've done a couple large-scale murals in DC, and then most recently I collaborated on a 405-foot mural in Crystal City, Virginia, which I'm told is the longest mural in the Maryland, Virginia, DC area. So that gave me an opportunity to work with 3 very experienced street artists. And,
now you have a trip coming up soon?
This week I'm going to Chicago and to paint on an arts building, and I'm told this is another poor area of Chicago, and it's another effort to sort of bring beautification to an otherwise poorer section of town. and it's an arts building, and I'm going to paint a female Buddha on there. And this is a place where the woman who invited me up there, I know she does spiritual retreats and goddess gatherings and spiritual detox and stuff like that. So,
any overseas trips? Upcoming?
Upcoming, yes. In September, I'll be going to France in a small town called Ussy outside of Paris. And I was invited there by a former Annapolitan who goes by the name of Mo Hansen. She used to do a lot of shows at 49 West.
Oh, okay.
And she has a farm out there, and it also functions as an artist residency where artists can come and work and relax and focus on what they do. And we're going to paint together, do some collaborative stuff. And she lives in a small town of around 900 people that I'm told it goes back to the days of Christ. I mean, it's an old town with murals that go back hundreds of years. So there's this history of murals there, but they keep updating them. And I've been invited to add to that town, and it happens to be the town where Andre the Giant grew up. So
the wrestling guy.
That's right, and his family's still there, and Mo still has coffee occasionally with his brother, and they're pretty poor and penniless. And one of the biggest street artists in America, Shepard Fairey, his fortune was kicked off by his street art logo called Obey Giant, which was a graphic he created in 1992 of Andre the Giant, and went on to make millions and millions of dollars. Yet his family, Andre the Giant's family, is pretty penniless out there. So we're going to try and do a tribute portrait to him and
wonderful.
Do something to honor the family there.
Many words come to mind in your life: hustler, resiliency, watershed moments, artists, quite a few. And wow, Jeff, I'm overwhelmed by your story. Is there anything you'd like to tell our viewing audience, maybe even young people, message of hope?
Yeah. I think, well, my philosophy in life is pretty simple and goes a long way. Be kind and be open-minded. So I try to follow that as much as I can to get along in the world and keep myself out of trouble as much as possible, so I can keep following my bliss. And that's the other thing that I would always try to encourage people to do, is to follow their bliss and find what it is they're passionate about in life, and then go after it. And there are a lot of groups around Annapolis who focus on that. One, namely, is Creating Communities by Rob Levitt. And so occasionally, Jimmy Davies and I get to do workshops in my studio for Creating Communities, and those are kids that we get to help and teach them history through the art making process. We teach them about historical figures, which is a huge subject for me. So this gives me an opportunity to really share my experience and my space, my studio, and my work with these kids, and let them see for themselves, how I've turned out and how I function in the world, and how I've been able to continuously focus on what's important to me, what makes me happy and what makes me tick, and really go after it and own that thing. So
you've had a great foundation as far as artists, as far as your family's concerned, and you went right back to your roots. And that was wonderful. You had something to grow on. Now, Jeff, give us some information about your studio and your shop, website, and those important things.
Well, I have a website that features my artwork. It's my name, jeffhuntington.com. And in Ward 3 on Hudson Street, I have Jaru Custom Screen Printing, and that is jaru.com. That's spelled Jahru, and that's where I sell custom screen printed t-shirts and hoodies and hockey jerseys and things like that.
All right. Well, wonderful. Thank you so much, Jeff, for appearing on Watershed Moments, and thank you all for watching.